I'm Dave Wilderman. I'm the program ecologist with the Natural Areas Program, which is a state program within the Department of Natural Resources. We're here at Mima Mounds Natural Area Preserve today, one of our prairie management sites. It's a natural area preserve. And we manage, statewide, we manage 96 different natural areas in kind of two different categories, including natural area preserves like this and natural resources conservation areas, or NRCAs. The NRCAs are typically larger sites and often have public access in terms of hiking trails, sometimes camping, and some examples of that are like Mount Si, which is east of Seattle, has a lot of hiking trails on it, popular site. Woodard Bay, closer here to Olympia, is another conservation area that we manage. And then the natural area preserves tend to be smaller and are sometimes have some public access, like Mima Mounds, which has interpretive trails, but many times they don't, and they're primarily for conservation of rare features and for research and education uses by permit. So they're a little bit different. The conservation areas are also intended to protect some rare features and ecosystems, but they also have that public use component to them. The natural area preserves, again, are typically protecting examples of rare ecosystems like prairies or wetlands or high alpine communities, bogs, salt marsh. We have a real wide range of different ecosystems that we protect in natural areas, as well as a number of rare species, rare plant species and rare animals, both. So that's what our program is set up to do. Here at Mima Mounds, we have a pretty intensive level of management. Different natural areas, as you might imagine, need different levels of management. In old growth forest, for example, there's not a lot of typically much restoration to do. It's a fairly low level of management, some invasive species control, and occasional monitoring. A site like Mima Mounds is kind of on the other end of the spectrum in that it requires a lot more human input and restoration and management to maintain it. And we'll talk about all those methods a little later. First, let's talk about the prairies, though. So this site is an example of our Western Washington prairies. And you may not have ever seen prairies in Western Washington. We tend to think of the vegetation here as being conifer forest primarily. These are very limited in extent, especially now, but historically there were about 150,000 acres of these prairies, basically from Tacoma south to Chehalis, and we're near the southern end of that. So these prairies are very unique for Western Washington, and they're formed by, or the things that helped form them are basically geology and soils, climate, and human management or cultural management. So the geology piece is that at the end of the last glaciation, 13 to 15,000 years ago, as the Puget Lobe of the continental glacier was melting, there was a lot of water washing out of that, moving a lot of coarse soil material, so sand and gravel and rock, that accumulated here near the southern end, and I've got a map of where it is located. But all that accumulated here at the southern end of the glacial lobe, and they call that glacial outwash. And in fact, these prairies are called glacial outwash prairies because those soils are very well drained. They get dry, they don't hold much soil moisture, and so they favor drought-tolerant species, primarily grasses and forbs, not so much trees and shrubs. The climate part comes in where it's somewhat changed over time. Initially, based on pollen records, we know these areas were mostly tundra and conifer forest shortly after the glacial period. And then a few thousand years went by, and about 10,000 years ago, the climate warmed, and that's when this, according to pollen records again, became more prairie like what we have today. But then the climate again cooled and got more moist about 4,000 years ago, and at that time the prairies were then maintained by human management or cultural management, by Native American burning primarily. and other plant cultivation techniques that they used, digging camas and other plants that were important food plants and medicinal plants. So that's where how these prairies exist here on the landscape. As I said, historically, we estimate there were about 150,000 acres of this prairie oak landscape. We tend to mix prairie and oak together. And that's based on the mapping of those soil types, those glacial outwash soils. Now, fast forward to Euro-American settlement, and most of these areas were prime agricultural land. Settlement occurred on many of them, and also the Native American burning mostly ceased at that time. And so a lot of these prairies were converted to other uses. Trees and shrubs encroached on many of them because of the lack of burning. And as of now, we've lost over 95% of what was originally here. There's only about 3% of the prairie that's still in good ecological condition, meaning dominated by native species, not a lot of Scotch broom or other non-native species, and good diversity of native plants as well. So there's just very small amounts of it and mostly very fragmented habitat left. So we're working very hard to try to maintain what we have, and Mima Mounds is one of the larger pieces of that good condition prairie that's left today. Okay, so our management here at Mima Mounds Natural Area Preserve has a lot of different components to it. We're trying to, first and foremost, manage for the prairie habitat, prairie vegetation as a whole, and maintain all the native species, diversity, and composition that make up that habitat. And that includes a lot of different species, like Romer's fescue is the dominant grass of most of these prairies. We can see some of that around us here. There's several other native grasses that are part of this system, and these are mostly bunch grasses, so they're small tufted grasses, as opposed to something like this is actually a non-native species that's more of a turf-forming grass. And then there are a lot of different what we call forbs or wildflowers, like camas, which was an important Native American food. There's spring gold, which is a little lomatium plant. There's violets. There's some rare plants like golden paintbrush, which we're trying to restore to this site. There's an existing rare plant called the white top aster. So we have this whole suite of plant species that we're trying to manage for. Then there are also other things like butterflies, or a number of rare butterflies that are associated with prairies, including here at Mima Mounds, like the great spangled fritillary, the valley silver spot, the Oregon common branded skipper, and the valley silver spot is in good numbers here, and it uses specific host plant, being one of the violet plants. That's the only plant it will lay its eggs on and that the larvae will eat. So it's very important to maintain not just that plant for that butterfly, but many of the other plants for other butterfly species. There's many other insects here, of course, some we know about, some we don't. There's some birds that are also prairie associated and are declining, and so we're trying to maintain habitat for those. We also have some rare lichens here that were just discovered here about 15 years ago, the first place they were discovered in the United States. And so all these things, some of them have differing habitat needs for themselves, like the different butterflies and birds. Some of them respond to the management things we do differently. And most of the management that we do includes invasive species control of various types. We do herbicide applications, we do hand pulling, we do mowing, so it's an integrated weed management approach. We also do prescribed burning to try to maintain the habitat and recreate that natural process that was maintaining the prairies for thousands of years. And then we do a lot of adding seed and plants, planting plugs of native plants to try to maintain and increase the diversity and focus some of those on, like the butterfly host plants, trying to maintain and enhance the populations for those species. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about some of the invasive species that are here at Mima Mounds. There are 30 or 40 invasive species, introduced plants that aren't native to the prairie that are here. And we spend a lot of time trying to control them, but we can't control all of those, so we focus on a few that are the highest priority and are having the most ecological impact. One of those is, of course, Scotch broom, which many of you are probably familiar with. And if you look in the background here, you can see kind of a wall of Scotch broom here, and there's a fence. The fence is not what's holding it back, even though it might look that way. We're actually doing a lot of work to control it on the site here. So Scotch broom is a shrub that's introduced from Europe, and as you can see, it can get quite dense and take over areas, especially out in open habitats like prairies. It can shade out many of the native plants. It prevents, like butterflies, some of the rare butterflies or other species from being able to even access areas. So this is a particularly important plant for us to control. It also fixes nitrogen. It has bacteria associated with the roots that take nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. And that's a problem for our native prairies because they're naturally a very nitrogen deficient ecosystem, and so the native plants are adapted to that. And when you add nitrogen, it alters the system. So Scotch broom is one of those really high priority species we're trying to control. And you can see what it looks like here without any effort at control. And parts of Mima Mounds used to look like this back starting about in the 1970s, so about 50 years ago. It started to invade the Mima Mounds site. And our control efforts really began in earnest in the early 90s. And we've been working on it, and it's a major part of our work every year. We have crews spending many hours every year doing, again, integrated pest management. So we do some targeted herbicide application. We mow. We have staff and volunteers who come out and do a lot of hand pulling. We also try to do prescribed burning, which I mentioned earlier, but prescribed burning is a good way to control Scotch broom if you can maintain the burning regime. Scotch broom has a long-lived seed bank up to 70 or 80 years. It'll persist in the soil. And so if you have seed in the soil, you're going to continue to get germination of new plants over time. So it's really a plant that you have to maintain an effort on for many years in order to control it in perpetuity. And again, it's very important because with this kind of habitat, we're not going to have most of the native plants, the rare butterflies, most of the native wildlife in general. So it's a really high priority for us to control. Again, we try to do all those different methods. The burning works really well when you can do it. We're limited on when we can burn by weather and fuel conditions and other factors, so that's difficult to do, but we do as much as we can. Burning will kill off the adult plants like this, and if it's hot enough, it'll prevent any of them from resprouting. A light fire, sometimes it will resprout. But what it also does is it triggers that seed bank to resprout. And so it's important you have to come back in the subsequent few years and do some other method of control to control those seedlings. Ideally, we would burn an area like this about every 3 years, 3 or 4 times in a row, and that should exhaust the seed bank. In practice, that's difficult to achieve, that many burns on a site, so we have to use other methods in combination, like herbicide and mowing and hand pulling. So that's one of our key invasive plants. Another one is something called tall oak grass, and this is an introduced grass from Asia and Europe. And it's different from our native grasses in that, as I mentioned before, our native grasses are bunch grasses. This is a turf-forming grass, so it can spread from the roots underground. It also gets very tall, much taller than our native grasses. So it can also block access, like the Scotch broom, for butterflies and other insects and even birds into areas. One of the difficult things about controlling this, if you can see here, is I dug this up just over here. it forms these what are called corms. They're little underground nutrient storage structures, kind of like a bulb. But they're alive, and some of these plants can put on several of these corms. And really the only way to control this is with herbicides, and we use a grass-specific herbicide so we don't damage the other plant species. But often what happens is the herbicide will only absorb into the top one or two of these corms, where the ones below it stay alive and then send up shoots. And that's actually, I don't know if you can see it, but that's happening on this plant. There's a little green shoot coming off of the bottom down here. So that makes it particularly difficult to control, and that took years of research to understand exactly what was going on and come up with some, recommended methods that'll help control it effectively, including having to apply herbicide multiple times in a year, or ideally going in after a prescribed burn and controlling the regrowth when it's more susceptible. The herbicides tend to work better after you do a prescribed burn. So those are kind of our two really key native plants or non-native plants that we're trying to control here at Mima Mounds. There are, as I mentioned, a number of others that we do try to control in very targeted areas, but these we're trying to control throughout the site. So normally when we think about, most people think about invasive species, we think about introduced plants or introduced species like the Scotch broom or the tall oak grass. But here in the prairies in particular, and in some other systems, but especially in the prairies, some of our native species are considered invasive as well. For example, Douglas fir, which you see all these large trees, mature trees behind me. Maybe you can tell they're growing on mounds. We know from the fact that the mounds are there that that's prairie soils. And historically, all of this behind me would have been prairie or maybe some scattered oak trees as well, like what we're looking at out here. So Douglas fir is an invasive species in the prairies, along with a number of other shrubs, because of that lack of fire and that natural disturbance, that recurring disturbance that historically would have kept them out of the prairies or at very low numbers. And you can see what happens without that disturbance pattern. We've had a large invasion of Douglas fir trees here behind us. Started probably 150 years ago, judging from the size and age of a lot of these trees. We also have some shrubs over here. That looks like a hazelnut. And other species of shrubs like cascara is one of the main invasive native shrubs in the prairies. Snowberry, serviceberry, ocean spray. There are a number of species that probably naturally, even with fire, would be found sporadically in small numbers, but without that fire they just gradually increase and can dominate the prairie and turn it into a shrubland or a forest rather than a grassland. You can see we've taken out some of the large trees. If you see some of the stumps here, we actually, about 20 years ago, cut down many of these invading trees where they were a little more open, not quite as dense and as many as behind us, but we cut them out, flew them out by helicopter to try to stop that process of invasion from the Douglas firs. Of course, prescribed burning also helps with that. And then we also do a lot of mechanical removal, just cutting out. We try to get them when they're small now. So we'll cut out a lot of the small Douglas firs or some of the shrubs even to try to reduce their numbers within the prairie. Okay, so here we're on top of our interpretive center here at Mima Mounds. You can see it's designed to look like a concrete mound. That was the idea behind the construction of it. And there's some signs down below that describe the ecology and the geology of the site. And this fits in with part of our mission. In addition to research and conservation and habitat restoration, we do have a focus on public access at certain sites as well, like Mima Mounds. We have a paved trail system and like a 3.5-mile dirt loop trail system altogether, as well as the interpretive center here. And this is a little bit unusual for a natural area preserve. which are primarily for research and education uses, and often very small and don't have much opportunity for public access because they're so small and very sensitive. But our natural resource conservation areas typically do have public access and hiking trails and even camping in some cases, as well as interpretive trails like here at Mima Mounds. So this fits in with our mission to have public education and access for our natural areas. So here we're on a portion of the Mima Mounds Natural Area Preserve where we're managing for one of our rare butterfly species. This is a 5-acre piece of property that was just added to the preserve 6 or 7 years ago. And we're managing it for the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, one of the rare butterfly species that used to occur here. The last ones were seen here in the mid-1990s, 1994, I think was the last time one was seen on this site. And that's about the time many of the populations of this species started to disappear. It used to be found from Vancouver Island down through the Willamette Valley. It's a species that's very specific to grasslands, prairies, and what we call grassland bald habitats. That's where its food plants are found. But in the mid-1990s, many of the populations started disappearing and down to just a handful in the Willamette Valley, one here on Joint Base Lewis McChord, and some up on the Olympic Peninsula, and 1 or 2 up in Canada. And so it's really dwindled down to just a handful of populations. So there's a large effort to recover this species, especially here in the South Sound, but also throughout its range. And we're part of that effort, working with various partners, with the military at Joint Base Lewis McChord, with Center for Natural Lands Management, a nonprofit that does a lot of seed propagation and plant propagation. The Sustainable Prisons Program that also does a lot of plant propagation, and other state agencies that manage other land. So we're all working together in this region here to try to help recover this species on as many sites as possible. So here we are, we're sort of toward the southern end of the site. Earlier when we were talking, we were at the far north end of the site. So if you look at a map, you can kind of maybe pick out where we are. There's a tree line back in the background here. But there's a fairly nice patch of prairie habitat here. And the reason we're focused on this area for the Taylor's checker spot is that it contains some of the key plant species that it really relies on. And we're trying to add to that and enhance the habitat to make it even better, so that we can eventually come out and release the larvae here to establish a population. So this species, to go into the life history a little bit, it's a butterfly the adults are out flying in April to May typically. They fly for about 10 days, an individual that is. Their population will be out flying for up to a month or so. The different ones come out slightly different timing. So the adults are out flying. The females lay their eggs on very specific host plant species, or oviposition plants we call them, including harsh paintbrush. That's a native species. And the other key one is an introduced plant called plantain, lance-leaf plantain, Plantago lanceolata. Many of the populations have switched to using that plantain because it's much more abundant than the harsh paintbrush. So they need those plants to lay their eggs on. The caterpillars, they're tiny little, maybe 1/2 an inch long, little black things, very hard to find in the vegetation. But they come out after about a week or 2, the eggs hatch, the larvae come out, feed on those host plants. That's why they're so important, because that's the only thing they'll feed on. And then they go into what's called diapause, which is basically hibernation in the late summer when the plants that they're feeding on start to dry out. At that point, they go down into the soil surface or under rocks or little tunnels in the soil, and basically stay there in hibernation or diapause until the following winter, late winter, February, when things start to warm up a little bit, the plants start to green up and grow, and they can feed again. So then they come back out, they feed for a few months, then they go and they pupate and metamorphosize and come out as an adult again in April or May. and start the life cycle over again. So those host plants are really critical. They also need the right kind of nectar plants. They need some other food plants when they come out of diapause. It's called post-diapause host plants or food plants. And that's when they come out in the late winter. They use different plants than they did when they were born, when they hatched out as small larvae. So you need another suite of plants for them to use at that point. So having all those different components together in the right place, in the right amounts, is really important to maintaining population of the species. And historically, when we had 150,000 acres of prairie and recurrent fires and a lot of habitat diversity throughout that, there was a lot of those right pieces of the habitat in the right places at any given time. Now that we're down to such a small amount of prairie habitat remaining and it's very fragmented, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work and trying to manage all those things in one small place. So that's why we have to put a lot of effort into trying to get all those pieces together on the right piece of land to support a population. So the reason we kind of selected this particular property after we purchased it was there was a lot of that plantain on this property, and it's not a species we want to introduce more of or seed intentionally or plant out because it's not a native plant, and that's against our policies for managing these sites. But since it was here, we decided we will manage it and try to enhance the other parts of the habitat that the butterfly needs in addition to that plantain, and get it up to a point where we could release the larvae. So what we have been doing, we did a prescribed burn in 2015 throughout this whole area that you're seeing kind of behind me and in front of me here. There was Scotch broom. We've controlled the patches of Scotch broom with mowing initially, and then some herbicide, and then the prescribed burn, and that's been very successful. We've also been controlling tall oak grass, which I mentioned earlier, which was scattered through here, and we've been very successful at that. And then after the burn, we went through and we seeded with many native plants, including some of the nectar plants. I didn't mention nectar plants yet, but they also need nectar, so they need things like sea blush. They also use saxifrage and strawberries and spring gold, the lomation. So we're trying to enhance those nectar populations as well. And what else have we done here? Well, we've planted golden paintbrush, which could be a host plant for it as well, like the harsh paintbrush that I mentioned earlier. So we're hoping they will be able to use that eventually. But those are the key things we've been doing, and part of it is also managing the vegetation structure. They need very low, open vegetation. They don't like a lot of dense vegetation or tall vegetation. They want low growing and a lot of kind of bare ground and open spaces where they can capture heat, because they're an insect. They need to absorb the sun and heat to stay active. And they also need that to be able to find their host plants, because that plantain particularly is a very low growing flat plant, so they need to be able to access it to lay the eggs, and then the larvae need to be able to travel from one plant of that to another to be able to feed. So those are a lot of the different components of trying to enhance habitat for these different life stages of the butterfly.